Welcome to the Friday Conversation series. I think this is our fourth one. Might be fifth, probably fourth. And today's topic is South Africa. And we're very excited to have a friend of Office of International Initiatives, friend of Georgia State, friend of World Affairs Council of Atlanta, Dr. Cedric Suzman, who's going to be leading our conversation today. And serving as his interviewer today is Dr. Carrie Manning. She's professor and chair of the Political Science Department, and she brings quite a wealth of knowledge and experience, especially in the politics and issues in Africa. So just a few housekeeping items. Please make sure your cell phones are turned off or on silent, maybe not even vibrate.
Good idea.
Good idea. And I should probably make sure mine is as well. If you need the restroom, it's just outside and to the right. There is an evaluation in front of you, so please be sure to fill that out. You can either leave it on your table, or if you have to leave early, just kindly put it on the table, or like I said, leave it right where you're sitting. We'll start off with our conversation series, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after they're finished. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Carrie Manning and Dr. Cedric Suzman.
Okay, thanks Amanda. Thanks to all of you for coming in on this rainy Friday. I feel like everyone's very far away. Obviously reserved seats for the diplomats that will be coming later on. Don't be shy, come on up to the front. I wanted to start by maybe asking you, Cedric, to say a little bit about your own background and where you're coming from on all of this.
Well, thank you, because you'll hear very quickly that my accent is not any deep south, it's further south, it's South African. I have been in Atlanta 40 years now, 1974, 41 years, my goodness. So I've lived here longer than I've lived in South Africa. But I have gone back there almost every year, every other year for all this time. So I've kept closely with it. I did an engineering degree at the University Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, which was then really the #1 university. University of Cape Town was, we like to say, second, but they didn't think so. And in fact, the rankings have switched a little since then, and it's a very interesting story. Why? Largely over the whole question of integrating the universities. But I remember during my time as a student that although the engineers were the conservative ones, most of my friends were in liberal arts, and they were playing bridge in the afternoon or whatever, while we had to go into the labs and keep going literally 8-hour days. But I did participate in a number of protests at the time. The university at that time had a few black lecturers. They weren't professors, but they were the rank of lecturer. And a small number of black students were admitted for special reasons. And they did have a medical school that was still integrated. But the government by that time was the nationalist government that came into power in 1948. And by the 1950s that we're talking about, they were starting to close down any integration of the universities. It was the reverse. They were closing us down. So we protested. We stood outside with placards. We walked through the center of Johannesburg with our academic gowns on, and to almost no avail. But it certainly got a lot of attention. And certainly the attention then of the so-called special branch of the police, who were the secret police, if you like, who watched everything. They'd walk down the line of the protesters with a camera, click, 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 getting all your photos, and they'd all go back to make sure that you were on record. And I guess if they saw you too often, you'd probably get a visit from them. And you'd have to say, what are you doing? So, and we go one step further. So the attitude at that time was, at least on our parents' part and our family, was do something that will make you exportable, which is really very sad if you think about it, that the elite students, because I guess we were certainly white in that case, elite, were always looking to leave and to get out. And that's why I did engineering, actually, although I never practiced as an engineer. It was a great education and an entree. And I came via London to Harvard, to the business school, and back to South Africa for 6 years because we had a family business, and then eventually, and I had an American wife then, and back to Atlanta in '74. So, in a way, my history is a product of what was going on in the country. It was a very difficult and, if you would, somewhat liberal and aware, a very unpleasant country to live in, and getting increasingly tight in what you could do and what you could say.
Many of you probably know about the system of apartheid in South Africa, but Cedric, maybe you can kind of run down the major pillars of,
Well, I think you've got to put it in the context of the 40s and 50s all over the world, and certainly the south of the United States, where segregation is the norm. Whether it was in India with the British and the Indians, totally kept apart, but it was all over Africa, as you know, the East Coast, the West Coast. So that was the British norm of segregation in its normal form, where black people were mostly workers or farm labourers or out there, and certainly not part of social society. When the nationalist government, the Afrikaner base, they were descendants of the Dutch, they were the farmers who were now becoming slowly more industrialists as well, but they gained power. And they brought in, under their first Prime Minister, Verwoerd, he was a sociology professor at the University of Stellenbosch, and he brought in a whole concept of separate but equal, which we know is a fabrication. And this was not of equal, it was just separate. And he's quoted as saying, what need do blacks have for mathematics? They should be hewers of wood and drawers of water in our society, and the workers in the factories and the fields. And that was the attitude, and it got in, and so they slowly closed down every opportunity for integration that there was. There were some integrated suburbs, more or less. There were the whole structure was basically became a theoretical nightmare.
I ask because one of the things that I've heard you talk about before is the social contract for South Africa. I mean, South Africa's only been a multiracial, sort of full formal democracy for about 20 years now. And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, given the history of apartheid, you could think of apartheid in some ways as the attempt by the Afrikaner community to kind of advance their own interests. And then when multiracial democracy comes in, now you have a kind of attempt to really rework all of this history. I mean, try to address all of this history through a system of competitive elections, which is a sort of tricky way to try to do social transformation. So, what do you think? Can you talk about some of the challenges to kind of building now this inclusive society on multiple levels?
It's an amazing story, and most of it revolves around Nelson Mandela. But the concept of a social contract is, I mean, I don't know the political science definition, but as I see it, it's really governing by the consent of the governed. It's a contract between the government and the people, and all the people, in an inclusive sense. And South Africa was never in that situation, because under white rule, it was a white government without consent of the blacks. And what most whites feared at the time of the transition to majority rule in 1994 was that it would be a government by blacks and the whites would be excluded. And the question then is, in this revolutionary society, which it was, how do you build a social contract? And Nelson Mandela had the amazing wisdom, after 27 years of detention and sometimes solitary confinement and others not, to realize that reconciliation was more important than justice, that we had to find a way of bringing the groups together, so that the first government had the former president, the Afrikaner president, F.W. de Klerk, who we shared a Nobel Prize with, was made deputy president. And so that the cabinet was brought in from the old cabinet, the old government and the new government. The police had, he had the white police, and the head of the army stood next to him, of the South African Defence Force, which was all white at that, not all white, it had some black units, but mostly white, stood next to him when he was sworn in. he said, keep your enemies close to you. And he was very afraid of a coup of some sort by the Afrikaners. And so he very deliberately tried to be inclusive. He also said at the time that no white civil servants would be fired, no white teachers would be fired. Many left in droves when the black government came in because they didn't want to be under black leadership or whatever, or they were afraid or whatever. But it was not done, by law. It was a slow process. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. And then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's been in Atlanta and at Emory many times. And he had a white counterpart, Alex Borain, from the progressive side of the white government, parliament. And there they said we bring out the truth, but we can't have justice for everyone because there are too many. It would take 100 years to try a normal court of law. And so that was the rationale of people coming forward, speaking, telling the truth, showing what had happened. And many whites, the majority, were really shocked at what came out. Those on the left, and I would say as many left students, had come across it and were pretty familiar with the brutality. But most whites turned their faces away. Just as under the Jim Crow era here.
Yeah, I remember I was living in Mozambique at the time that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was happening, and I visited South Africa quite a bit, and I remember hearing people say, gosh, I mean, it was just stunning to see these stories being told in the media, and people hearing South Africans say that these were revelations to them, and it was hard to imagine how that was the case. But
well, see no evil, speak no evil, and let the world go on around you.
Yeah, and so, I mean, certainly South Africa is an anomaly in so many ways. It's because of the transformation that you just described, and also because in the region where South Africa is located, I mean, it's sort of the giant with giant potential. Its economy is far more industrialized than most of the countries around it. It's a hub attracting people from all over the continent. But it's also had some struggles economically, like everyone else was hit by the recession in 2009 and has had a slow recovery. And even though, so I want you to talk a little bit now about moving forward. I mean, we had the 1994, the transition in the 90s, some really remarkable things occurred, and then the hard work comes of we've laid down this foundation for democracy, we've laid out rules for black economic empowerment, and now what do we do? How can we realize this potential in moving forward? So what are some of the things you've seen?
It again is a complicated story, and I think it has a lot to do with leadership. And it starts, I'm just going to do 3 quick scenarios. Nelson Mandela focused on reconciliation and building a country, a unitary country. He wanted Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now currently the deputy president, to succeed him. He'd been a mine workers union leader. He had also chaired the convention that drafted the new constitution. But Mandela also said, I'm a servant of the ANC, the African National Congress, the political party that had come to power. And he was outvoted, and they put in Thabo Mbeki, who had been a leader of the guerrilla movements and the opposition movements outside of South Africa while Mandela was in prison. And Thabo Mbeki's father, Gowan Mbeki, was a great friend of Mandela's during the early years, but older. So he accepted Mbeki. Mandela really ruled and made decisions for the country as a whole, even though he said, I'm a servant to the ANC. Mbeki had a very small kitchen cabinet, they called it, around him, of trusted people very close to him, and that's how he made decisions. He was very suspicious of the Western world. He made that huge mistake of denying HIV caused AIDS, and latched on to some of the crackpots, some of whom were from Berkeley and California as well. But he really had deep suspicion of the West. He thought you're just trying to sell us drugs, that's all. And so this chip on his shoulder was a problem. And he did fairly well economically. He brought in a very competent Minister of Finance. They have a first-rate financial system in South Africa, up to Western standards, world standards. They have a very strong manufacturing sector. They have all the resources of minerals, gold, diamonds, coal, steel, iron ore, you name it. So they've got a very strong industrial base, and this all helped to push the country forward and keep it going. But Mbeki made some of those mistakes, and eventually, in the middle of his second term, he was voted out of power because of the small little clique way he was ruling. And they brought in Jacob Zuma, who's the current president. And Zuma was a leader, I think, of the intelligence. He was one of the guerrilla leaders out literally in the bush fighting. He has almost no education, just a few years of schooling, but very charismatic and quite an orator. And they chose him to be the next president, to succeed Mbeki. And the problem with Zuma is he was also tainted with a huge corruption scandal, and had been taken to court and got off on technicalities time after time. The corruption, interestingly, and you should get it in perspective, is Western countries, French, British, Dutch, selling submarines and arms to the South African government, and the ministers taking a cut of the price. And Zuma was involved in that, as were other cabinet level people. And nobody wanted it to come out because most of the cabinet would have been implicated, and so it never really got through the courts fully. But what it did is prevented him addressing one of the most serious problems that was starting to arise, and that's corruption. Corruption used to be pretty rare in South Africa compared to many countries, but it's become endemic at every level. And Zuma has ruled, and I have to go back to your question, I should think. Zuma really has ruled through the party, through the African National Congress. And really the party has become the government. It's almost a Leninist model, like Russia, the Communist Party set the rules here. All the rules are set by the party, and if you're not a loyal party member, you won't be a rent collector, you won't be a town councillor, you won't be a mayor, you won't be a state governor, you won't be certainly in parliament. And so all the loyalty has to be towards the ANC, which has about 62% of the seats in parliament. And what happens with that is you get promoted not on merit, but on party loyalty. And that eventually degrades the whole standard and process of government and of efficiency. And you've seen it in the electricity supplies, where they've got huge blackouts now, of the railways, where they can't deliver the coal to the power stations. There are all kinds of poor government, poor governance. And as there's an black South African woman chairman of Shell, and she wrote an interesting little piece talking about the need for efficiency, not only in management, better management in government. And that's all corroded under Zuma, because he really doesn't have the intellectual background or the leadership to make it happen. And he's put there by the party, and he defers to the party.
So to what extent do you think Julius Malema's group, these economic freedom fighters, this party, I mean, to what extent is that a result of the things you're talking about? To what extent is it going to, I don't know, balance that or exacerbate that?
I'm going to go back a little bit to another little piece of history in the social contract. Basically, when Mandela came to power, there was a tacit agreement that the blacks, South African blacks, would run the government, and the white South Africans would run the business community, as they had all along. And that was a kind of, and that then you would bring black leaders into those white businesses as shareholders, as senior directors, as managers. Some were figureheads, many. Some were very competent, as you might imagine, and went on to make a lot of money and be very successful. But overall, it was a top-down integration process by tacit agreement. And those on the left in the party, in the ANC, felt that they had betrayed the freedom contract that they had, which was really nationalization of the mines, ownership of the land, and an inclusive, somewhat socialist-oriented society, which would bring equality to the whole population. And so what happened instead was these very wealthy black middle class, or upper middle class, and then you do get increasingly a growing black middle class who are workers and managers now. But the poor remain very poor, and South Africa's become one of the most unequal countries in income in the world. And that's a tragedy. And so those on the left, like Julius Malema was the leader of the youth wing, which Winnie Mandela used to head, and they always end up being, quote, the troublemakers, these young Turks kind of thing. And he shouted and screamed and got his own following against the government and against the abuses of the government. And he was forced out by Suzman from his leadership. So he formed a new party, the Economic Freedom Party. And when they opened, after the last elections, they got about 6% of the vote, which was pretty amazing. And they all went into Parliament wearing worker overalls, no suits and ties, and maids' uniforms with the women. And it caused an uproar in Parliament, and the Speaker called in the police to clear the chamber. And that itself caused an uproar. Like, how dare you, bring the police into Parliament? And it did a huge amount of damage to the credibility of Zuma and the party. And now there's this struggle going on left and right. And the truth of the matter is that the country needs jobs. And it's got unemployment of near 40%. It's one of the highest in the world, along with Greece, worse than Spain in many ways, and more endemic than those countries. And the only way they're going to address that problem is by faster economic growth. And you're not going to get it by nationalization, by taking over the farms, nationalizing the mines, nationalizing the railways, the electricity supply, because the government isn't capable of managing them. And this is what's happening. The country is sort of winding down. It's stuck in a 2%, 2.5% growth. And yes, I was talking to one of our colleagues, Professor Jacobus Boers, yesterday, and he asked me what I was going to say today. He's got a class, and I said, well, I regretfully think the glass is becoming half empty rather than half full. And for 40 years since I've been here, I've said there's hope for South Africa, and I'm starting to lose hope because the system at the top is crumbled. And whether they can turn that around or not remains to be seen. And so that's sort of the bright future from South Africa. It's got all the assets it needs to be great, except leadership at the moment.
So I think, without using the word politics so much, I mean, you've come back around to my favorite subject.
Yes.
That politics can fix, politics is needed to fix this. So, I mean, what South Africa is facing, of course, is, it has, as you pointed out, incredible potential. It even has the financial, the soft and the hard infrastructure. But it faces the kind of challenges that every developing country faces, even though I think South Africans don't think of South Africa as a developing country per se. But
It's like Mexico. It's a dual country.
Yeah,
it's got dual economy.
And
very poor and very rich.
And so you have, as you said, the one really pressing imperative is to keep the economy moving forward, but then while also trying to address some of these structural inequalities that exist. I mean, after a system of apartheid, you still have very segregated housing, you still have transportation costs are very high for workers, I imagine. I mean, it's hard for those things to be turned around in a day, and the thing that has to balance those two conflicting imperatives, I guess, is politics. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about politics was at its
But you
heart.
know, people said after 10 years, how long will the people wait to get jobs, to be equal, for it to make a difference to the people at the bottom? Because if you spoke to them, they said, it's really not much better. You know, we're not being arrested on the street for not having our documents to live in the city. And actually, there's a huge change. I hated going back before 1994. It was oppressive, it was sad, and the whites sort of looked at you like a traitor because you'd left. After that, you could breathe. It opened up. It's a wonderful country. You go to Cape Town, and there's more integration at lunchtime in the cafes by workers, office workers mostly, in Cape Town and Johannesburg than there is by far in Atlanta or New York. Because every group will have blacks, whites, Indians sitting around who've gone down from the office building to have lunch together. It's really very encouraging. But the system isn't working for them, and that's the trouble. You know, and I don't know how you, I think you can only address it with leadership. It's sort of like the AIDS thing was turned around because Zuma, for all his problems, embraced the need to address AIDS and antiretrovirals and the Gates and the Clinton initiative and the PEPFAR through the government poured money in, and they really turned the trajectory of AIDS infection around. You've got to do the same with corruption. Corruption has to be addressed from the top to bottom and made totally unacceptable. And no one's been able to take that stand.
And given that the ANC does play such a large role in directing the state, like in a lot of other countries that have a history of a liberation movement, I mean, it's within the party often where that reform has to take place and where that, because they are in control so much. So I think it's time to open up to audience questions. Does anyone have, yes, Amanda?
So first, that was really wonderful and really, really educational, especially for those of us who may not know a lot about South Africa, and thank you both for that dialogue. The juxtaposition that's been running through my mind throughout the whole conversation is, you know, the topic of today's conversation is, how bright is South Africa's future, question mark. But the other side is, how bright is South Africa's future, exclamation point. And a lot of what you're saying, sometimes I feel like we're talking about the exclamation point, and sometimes we're talking about the question mark. And so I recognize a lot of the faculty who are here who are doing work in and with South Africa. So I wonder if either of you or any of our faculty members can sort of talk about the opportunities for Georgia State. How bright is South Africa's future, question mark, and exclamation point.
I'm dying to ask Professor Manning her views too. I'd love to turn the tables on you.
No.
And I will any moment now. I'm just giving you a little warning. Before we end,
Okay.
I'm going to ask you for your
Fair
view at the end. But anyone else like to respond to your question?
Well,
Please.
I'd like to respond to the exclamation mark on the side where the bright future. Oh, I'm Gwen Benson. I'm Associate Dean for School and Community and International Partnerships in the College of Education. And we recently had about 22 students here on campus for about 2 weeks, taking them around to local schools. These were teacher education majors. That's why I think about it as a bright future, because these are young people who are not so tainted yet about the future and the politics of the country, but they're thinking about how are they going to take what they learn here and make a difference when they go back. Now, by far, a large number of them, well, a significant number of them would like to come back to Georgia State and do their graduate studies, but the majority of them want to go back to their country and make a difference in terms of education, which I think is really critical for the country in terms of the schools there, faculty exchanges, and looking at South Africa from a positive standpoint in terms of how we can help contribute to the future with the exclamation point sides. Just wanted to add that.
I must say most of the young people that I come into contact when they are positive about it and love it and find it vibrant and challenging. But you've got to see it in that. That's also the sort of employed in school being educated, and then we've got all of those. Look, it's not different in this country. It's true. We have the same challenges.
One thing that, so I'm John Marshall, I'm at the law school, and very much because of the generosity of the university, we're able to do some work now with the folks at the University of Cape Town and the University of Pretoria, which has been a great, great privilege. One thing that I've noticed as an American land use lawyer, and I have no international background or context other than my work in the United States, is that South Africa has done a very nice job, after part of the constitutional revision, with a move to a more regional governance structure, which has allowed them to think more about their land use problems combined with their natural resources problems. So in doing their land use planning, in the US it's a very local endeavor that involves cities, towns, counties that don't look beyond their borders. But when they restructured in South Africa, they broke down some of the barriers of the local governments that were there before to try to bring a greater regionalism to the way they make decisions, which is now helping them look at issues like sea level rise, for instance, in Cape Town, with the Cape Flats and all the very vulnerable families in the Cape Flats area that are quite poor. And obviously they lack resources, but they have an ability to work on some problems in a way that we don't even, in this country, have the ability to work on some of the similar problems. And I have a question for you, Doctor, but just also a quick plug. Next Friday, Jim Joseph, the former ambassador to South Africa, is speaking at the law school. And he is going to actually speak about my question to you, Doctor, which is, I think South Africa has a lot to teach the U.S. as far as reconciliation is concerned. And Dr. Joseph was, or Ambassador Joseph was head of the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Foundation after Hurricane Katrina. And he's spoken so eloquently about American apartheid and the fact that we skipped reconciliation, and we've seen so much about this past summer with the what's flowed out of Charleston. But I'd love to know, Dr. Suzman, your thoughts about what South Africa really in that process of reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, has to teach the U.S. about coming on one page and talking honestly about our history.
I think it's huge. I mean, I was watching Charlie Rose about 3 weeks ago, and they gave me the new book out, the African-American writer about segregation. No, get this name. But there were two people on the program with Charlie Rose, and the second African-American talked about reparations for slavery. And I've always have to admit that I considered it a rather fantasy, a crazy idea. I mean, come on, we've moved. No, there is a debt to be paid, and there is reconciliation to be done, and we're only a generation or two out of that situation, and the damage that was done is totally lasting. And all the studies now about where you grow up determines how you're going to do in later life is so indicative of this debt that has to be, we need to put the resources into upgrading the people that were disadvantaged. And that's what South Africa's trying to do without killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And I think you can do it if you have goodwill. I think you can't do it if you end up in a conflictual situation. And South Africa, unfortunately, the government now under Zuma has been making statements about mine nationalization or taking over the mineral rights, if not outright nationalization, about taking over the farmlands. And you see in Zimbabwe what a disaster it's been. Freedom of the press, because of the criticism of the government, is no longer allowed. You can't speak ill of the president. Well, come on. We know that that is just not the right way to go. And so it's those signs that have to be changed, because it's frightening foreign investors and it's frightening South African investors. But I think that in response to you, I think there's a lot to be learned and understood, and we've still got a way to go in this country. We really do. Everyone wants to be here, and so do I. But it helped a lot, and I think it's made racial issues in South Africa be on the back burner. You know, there are small towns and rural farms, and there's still bad treatment of people, but by and large, it's not a racial problem anymore. That's not the issue. It's growth and economics and inclusion, and how you, it's become an economic one, economic inclusion for those at the bottom, yeah.
I'm Renee Shadman from the Department of English, and we're establishing a relationship with the University of Western Cape. And they have a very interesting creative writing program there, which has 3 directors, one in charge of the Isikosa writers, Sadiwe Magona, one in charge of the Afrikaner writers, Antje Krok, and someone in charge of the English writers, Meg Vandermeer. But they also, so they each teach separately, but twice or 3 times a semester they bring their students together, and they all translate their works into English and then share them. And so that kind of sharing, they say, goes beyond what usually is typically happening. So that kind of cross-race but also cross-class exchange there seem to be opportunities for that happening, and that's something that our students can learn from as well too, because there's an opportunity of open dialogue that seems to be taking place. And also there's a place where the arts seem to be doing that kind of speaking back to power in a way that maybe the press is not so interested in hearing particular stories, but writers aren't being stopped along those lines. So there's a freedom of expression and dialogue that I think is encouraging for us to learn from.
Well, the amazing thing about South Africa is the freedom of the press and expression and the judiciary, which all along, actually the nationalist government had a very strange respect for the judiciary. Even though they tried to pack it and to control it, they never destroyed it. And so it has a very strong judicial system. But there are 11 official languages. So how do you work with that? But I mean, there's some amazing South African writers, as we know. Coetzee, Ethel Fugard, of course, with the plays, Andre Brink, and go on. Nadine Gordimer, Whiteside. So they really bring a lot of understanding to the complexity of the picture. What do you see as South Africa's role and influence, though, in the rest of Southern Africa? Because it had some of the highest social statistics in the region of SADC, the Southern African Development Community, and now it's near the bottom in growth and in education and in child mortality. But what's going on?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question a lot in the last 2 weeks because I had to write a piece about Mozambique, which is where I do a lot of my work. And of course, Mozambique has always been the poor neighbor of South Africa, but in the last 20 years, it's maintained about a 7% annual growth rate. And since its war ended, and especially since they've discovered very large reserves of coal and natural gas. And so one of the questions I was looking
Unfortunately for the environment.
I know, unfortunately for the environment and probably for the people who live near where those resources are located. Yeah. Well, definitely. So, but it's interesting because it does look like, it is kind of, the tables have turned now, and now Mozambique is just going, great guns. And one of the questions was, how has Mozambique suffered because of South Africa's economic decline? And I really couldn't find a lot of evidence that it has. And so it's interesting that economically, that there's been that shift, but also politically, I mean, it's fascinating to me how South Africa will always be the giant in the region. It will always be the most important, it will always be the reference country, I think, for everyone. But Mozambique's politics, I think a lot of the countries in the Southern Africa region in the last decade started to move toward the model that you described for the ANC, where the party is a more heavy-handed, ideology is playing a bigger role, loyalty tests to the party play a role in whether you can get a job. Zimbabwe, Guebuza in Mozambique, and Guebuza was just, served his 2 terms and didn't try to go for another one, but tried to stay president of the party. He did a lot of what you're saying Zuma's doing, and the party removed him. And everybody kind of breathed a sigh of relief that, okay, we're not going to go in this direction. But I do think that, South Africa shares with the rest of Southern Africa this interesting history of liberation movements. These parties are supposed, the ruling parties are supposed to be given and have been given a lot of legitimacy just by virtue of their historic role. But then when they start overstepping their bounds, it's difficult for anybody to call them on it who's outside of the party, exactly because of their history of the liberation struggle. And I think that's what South Africa shares with a lot of the countries in the Southern African region, and maybe its neighbors will now be providing some reference points for, for the ANC.
That is interesting. Yeah, I mean, the greatest contribution Mandela made was stepping down after one term. He said, I'm not going to serve another term because I'm getting older and it's time for other people to leave. Well, that's huge.
I do think, if I may, I wanted to say something about the TRC myself, because as a foreigner living, I had been in Mozambique, then I moved to South Africa right when the TRC's, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work started, and everything, all the proceedings were televised. It was the most incredible thing to see, to see people describing what, the atrocities that had occurred, to see the victims there in the same room, and, everybody, it's a very controversial process, right, in some respects, because there weren't, like you said, there's truth, but not necessarily justice. People don't get anything, you can't adequately compensate people for what happened. But I do think a lot about, especially in the last year, the fact that we have never had such a process. And as you said, I mean, it does, putting all that out there, as painful as it was, does seem to have served some purpose in kind of having a shared historical record. Like, okay, this is what we all agree really happened. And whereas sometimes when I look at things that happened in Ferguson or in Texas or whatever recently, I wonder if people have forgotten or aren't learning anymore that there are history. And so it puts people so far apart racially because essentially they have separate histories that we don't talk about in common and that we haven't had a forum to talk about, like South Africa has.
I read The Warmth of Other Suns. I don't know how many of you have read The Warmth of Other Suns, about the black migration from south to north. And it's an incredible story. And it shows both the south and the problems of the north in that you're experiencing today. So I think we have a huge amount to teach each other. And I think there was interaction between Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela. And there is still, I think, an affinity. It's so wonderful that Georgia State is partnering with institutions in South Africa. And you'd say, why South Africa? Why did they pick it? Well, there's a good reason, I think. And I think there's a lot to, the next election, we always say the next election will be so important. Well, the last one was very important, where the Democratic Alliance, which is the left, formerly largely white but increasingly integrated opposition party, now with a black leader, a very charismatic young man in his 30s, leading the party on the one side, and then on the other side of the opposition is this young man, Julius Malema, on the far left. And the Democratic Alliance is traditional liberal economics and market economy oriented. You've got the ANC, who sort of agreed to respect the market economy in the middle, but really has its Communist Party as its partners and its heart in the socialist camp. And so what's going to happen in the next election? Will it lose enough credibility for the Democratic Alliance to gain strength or not? And or will Malema, or will he just fizzle? It's hard to say. But it's a fascinating political process.
And that is one thing that's so interesting about South Africa. I mean, that sounds like a cliche, I guess, but the incredible diversity in South Africa in terms of, if you're in Cape Town or you're in the Cape area, it's like a whole different world from, Johannesburg, Pretoria. I mean, in terms of economically, there's diversity, geographically, not to mention culturally, and so it's hard to kind of capture when students ask, what's South Africa like? I'm like, it's like the whole world, really, in a, kind of in a way.
Well, a lot to do with history, because when the Cape was settled, there were the Khoi and the San peoples who were largely along the riverbanks and on the beaches, and hunters and gatherers. And the Xhosa people, the African people, as we know today, were not there yet. They were still further. They were coming down. And so the Cape was then settled by Cape Malays, who were brought in as slaves from Malaysia. And so the so-called coloured people are not just across the colour line, black-white, but they're Malays as well. And they don't speak African languages. They speak Afrikaans, not English, largely, as their first language. Which you say, how did that happen? Well, the Cape was settled by the Dutch, and so the Afrikaans became their language. But when you go up to Johannesburg, you can only understand South Africa when you see the mines. The gold mines are 2 miles deep. In order to go that deep, you need a huge technical infrastructure. You need steel, you need locomotives, you need air conditioning, you need water, you need pumps, you need a very sophisticated mining sector. And that built Johannesburg. And that's why you've got this very sophisticated sector sitting on top of manual labor and the miners picking at the rock face. The contrast is all there. That's exactly why it's so different. Very interesting.
Any other questions or comments from the audience?
Who else has been? Go.
One final question, I guess, for both discussants on the. I was surprised by how many mosques I saw in South Africa, in the Cape, particularly when I was there. Yeah. And yet, in the discussion about radicalization of Muslim communities across the world, South Africa has not really been a hotbed. There's not. It's interesting how, I don't know if the history of integration in a way there has made, and there are issues, but it's not like in Western Europe or in Southeast Asia. But I may be overlooking something, Dr. Suzman, but that was.
Well, I even learned a lot. The previous South African ambassador, immediately previous to the current ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, was Muslim. He was of Malay background. And he talked about how he was not allowed, he couldn't get married in a civil ceremony because they didn't recognize Muslim marriages when he was that age. Must be 20, 30 years ago. I was shocked, I had no idea. And it was only more recently, they had a Muslim ceremony and all the rest, and they were recognized. But that's part of why they're Muslim. But he was the governor of the Western Cape, which is the whole Cape province, where a lot of the mosques are. And there was a time when there was a group called Pahad, P-A-H-A-D, which became very violent and settled bombs and started sort of infiltrating and was becoming a terrorist kind of group. And there was even talk of affiliation with Al-Qaeda and things like that. But when he was governor, he got together with the police and they really stamped it out. They were arrested, they were contained, and with community-based participation, kind of pushed out. The community didn't absorb them and help them, and I think, but he has some wonderful stories. He spoke here with Professor Bazagar in the Department of Religion, had a discussion with him like this one time, and it was amazing actually. So it's a complicated, again, story. There are also a few Indians, most of them are not Muslim, but there's some that were brought in as sugarcane workers on the east coast of the town. So they're there. So there's quite a strong Muslim community, but by and large it's been South African, you're right. And fortunately, the moment it started to sort of get the fundamentalist view popping up, it was mainly because it was more drugs and violent-oriented, crime-oriented, rather than just fundamentalist. And that's, I think, what killed it. So when is Zimbabwe going to...
This is the question for me now.
Yes. Will it change when Mugabe goes? My reason for asking it is that just to connect it and say, South Africa has huge potential in the southern African region, because if you look from Angola with its oil and other resources, also very unequal and corrupt, unfortunately, and Mozambique on the other side, and you go across southern Africa and you take part of the Congo in as well, you've got, what, 180 million people. You've got a very large, hugely wealthy, underdeveloped region, with South Africa the potential of being the leader, if they can make good. But at the moment, the sticking point is Zimbabwe, which is sort of blocking the whole thing there, and then Congo really is still struggling to come right. But if you've got Zimbabwe, then you're up one more rung, and then the Congo, and then you can really look at an incredibly rich continent, subcontinent. So the future could be bright.
We shall see.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Well, if there are no further questions, please let's give Dr. Suzman and Manning a round of applause.